we've looked at some detail at mercantilism, and we saw the emergence there of the merchant class. Things were clearly changing, at least, there we were looking at the growth of economic thought. And one of the things that was changing was also that the influence and the power of the church, and that would have been the Christian church, first the Catholic, and then after the Protestant split, just the Christian church. Losing of influence in Europe, and there was also a diminishing of some of the powers of some of the kings and sovereigns. We certainly did see sort of a slow growth of the nation states. Now, I'm mentioning all of that because if we look at a modern society such as ours today, okay, we've got governments and there's a church, but pretty much what we see about ourselves and the way that we're living, depending, of course, on the country where you're living, is that there are quite a number of freedoms that we do have. But, I guess we take that for granted, but that wasn't always like that. And certainly at the period, the 15th century, the 16th century, even the 17th century, the church had a large influence on the lives of people with its teachings. And the question that started to emerge, and that is really what brings us then to the authors we looked at last week, that is now Hobbes and Locke and William Petty and so on, was that if people are really free to live their life the way they want to, if they don't necessarily have to follow the teachings of a church or any church, and if there's a growth, what they would have experienced in places like Holland, England, and other parts of Europe, was a sort of, the emergence of democracy, parliamentary, rather than just a parliament in England and Holland, rather than just a king who could rule as he wanted to. So the question that was posing itself is, how is a society, a well-ordered society, possible in this new environment where people don't really have to follow the dictates of the church and where the power of the king was diminishing? How is it possible that there can be an orderly society? So that's a really important question. If for the previous centuries, everybody was a churchgoer, and only bit by bit were people to lose their faith, and we've got to put it like this: people were losing their faith. And certainly, if you look at today, if you look at church attendance, all right, so in this emerging situation where the influence and the power of the church, and religion as a whole, as it was the case then, how is a orderly social life possible? And of course, the sub-question to that is, what does it mean for economic life? Well, we can just look at that. We can just look at that, from the present perspective. Does anybody have an idea, sort of, what percentage of the population believes in the existence of God today?
Way in South Africa.
Well, let's look at South Africa, yes.
I would give us 60%.
Okay, I would put it sort of at the same, pitch it at a similar level. Do you have an idea what's the situation, let's say, in a place like Europe?
I would have it at 20. I don't know, but I don't see a lot of
Yeah,
faith based
it,
coming from it.
it's probably somewhere there, like 20%, and even amongst the believers, let's say, whether it's the Protestant church, or I'm just talking about the Christian churches, which is still dominant, even though obviously we've also got to consider other faiths in Europe. But today, if you say maybe 20%, maybe isn't much more than that. I mean, we're living in an age where we don't believe in God. It's as simple as that, and that started to show and emerge. Sort of that trend started to emerge at the time that we've been talking of up to now. Thomas Hobbes. I mean, Thomas Hobbes would he was ambivalent whether he was a believer or not. And when you get to somebody like David Hume, and we've had a presentation uploaded on the WITS channel on David Hume, he died, and everybody, people that were there at his deathbed were waiting to see what he's going to say. Is he going to, in the last minute, change his mind and say, please forgive me, but now I believe in God, now that I'm dying? No, David Hume didn't, because he proclaimed for many years before that there is God does not exist. And people thought, well, he's gonna change his mind on his deathbed. That was not the case. And today, even if you look at people who supposedly believe in God, the proportion of those that actually go to church is maybe 10%, depending on the country. At its maximum, maybe 50%. And of course, we've got a good economic theory about faith and about religion. What would be the economic theory as to why people might believe in faith, or might believe and even go to church? What's an economic theory for that? What would economists say, sort of, about going to church and believing in God? Well, you might be thinking, how can there be an economic theory of that? And of course, to a degree, this is what we're going to be working towards. You've heard the expression, the imperialism of economics. Okay, it's not economic imperialism, like England being the imperial power over much of Southern Africa and other parts of Africa, but the imperialism of economics, namely economic ideas infiltrating other subject areas and having something to say about not only economic aspects of life, but having something to say about all aspects of our life, because that's what we're trying to do. Well, that's what much of economics tries to do. It sees itself, it defines itself, not so much anymore by the subject matter as by the tool. And so we've got the hand up by Mpumelelo.
Good evening.
Yes, Mpumelelo.
I wanted to ask, in regards to your question, do you mean what is the economic theory in relation to Catholicism, Protestantism, or Islam, or is it just basically religion?
It's the economic theory. What economists would say about okay, if we adopt a nominalist attitude, we wouldn't even talk about faith, would we? Because faith, what is faith? It's one of those intangibles that don't exist. So to begin with, if we sort of adopt a nominalist economic approach, we'd be saying, well, what we can actually see, we can't see faith, but we can to a degree see the effects of faith, and that is people going to church, people praying, and then the economic approach to that, or the economic question would be, is what motivates people to go to church, spend time going to church, where they, what are the benefits and gains, what are the returns, people putting money or giving money to the church, and so forth. I mean, it's just trying to figure out, how economics functions in this context. Any ideas?
Isn't it that it's irrational?
Well, why would it be irrational according to you?
It's irrational on the basis that if you are as an economic agent, your purpose is for you to be an input into the productive scheme of the economy, as well as to be an economic agent that maximizes the utility. So church is a function that takes away your income. So therefore, you cannot maximize your utility because there's a depreciation in your budget constraint. So therefore, it would be irrational.
All right. So it might well appear as irrational, and that's of course what many people will say of each other. If you see somebody going to church, you might be inclined to say, well, why would you want to do that? You are irrational. I saw Liesel's hand up. Did you want to say something, or?
Yes, Hume would say it's irrational because it's not based on proof.
It's not based on proof, okay? And so it becomes it. So they took, it's very interesting because now there is no proof that God exists, and nor do I suppose, could we say that God does? Is there any proof that God does not exist? Or certainly in a materialist world that we're living in and our nominalist mentality, we might be inclined to say, well, there's no proof that God exists, but it links back to what Mpumelelo was saying, namely, people are still going to, despite all of that, despite it being irrational or appearing to be irrational, people are going to church, people are praying. So something else, even the economists would have to say that something else in addition must be at work, and I guess that relates to what Liesl is saying. Something else must be at work because we assume that human beings are rational all the time. They are rational. So if we would now say that, well, it's irrational to go to church, we would have to say, well, our assumptions are wrong. People are not acting rationally. But the entire economic edifice is based on the idea that human beings are acting rational. So even if they're going to church, they've got to be rational about it. There's got to be something hidden that is not visible by or not detectable just by looking at the fact that, let's say you're putting money in there. And so it's related, I suppose, to what Liesl was saying, that, there's no proof, as Hume says, that God exists, but it's uncertain. And so the economic approach to faith would be to say, well, we don't really know, we don't know if God exists or doesn't exist. But if he does exist, and you didn't do your duty for your own salvation, then you are going to suffer the consequences. So an economist would say going to church and praying is like an investment. It's an investment under conditions of uncertainty, because there's some uncertainty. Does that make sense to you? Okay, that's the economic approach to the matter. And there's a field that's called the economics of religion. Yes, Chesri. Your hand is up, Chesri. Okay. Do you want to say something? All right, so I guess the hand is up by mistake. Now, we don't want to get too much in that direction, okay? I mean, you know, we might talk about faith, and we have to talk about it to a degree. But at the moment, I'm just raising it because belief, as we saw with Hume, the belief in God was diminishing, and therefore people did not feel that they were being held to account, so to say, by a higher power. And then we've got people like Hobbes, Hume, Locke asking, how is a society possible in those circumstances? And the answer that they're giving is that, well, we've seen the answer given by Hobbes. We've seen him saying that, well, there ought to be a Leviathan, if possible. And there's a social contract, more important than a Leviathan. First is a social contract, because you can have a social contract that doesn't necessarily presuppose a Leviathan. You know, a social contract would also exist in terms of a democracy, and it's rational to subject ourselves to this social contract. And Locke showed that, well, you can actually have a sort of a system of property that leads to an outcome that is actually quite commendable. We've got the beginnings of the liberal thinking on these matters, and of course, and many people look at Adam Smith, for instance, and the physiocrats that we'll be looking at today as being part of that tradition, trying to identify how can society function orderly in the absence of an all-powerful God, or in the absence of an all-powerful church, and in the absence of an all-powerful government even. And so, I mean, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that there is no God, quite the opposite. But this is part and parcel of the Enlightenment period, where people are now humanity is becoming confident about its own ability, its own enlightenment, and therefore, enlightenment really means emerging from the Dark Ages and emerging from your subordination to church authority. So another way to look at this, just briefly, is that whereas from Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas, we might get to talk about Thomas Aquinas very briefly. It was like what determined the actions. It's as if it's like a vertical dictate that you are told from above how you must behave and what is just and what is not just and what is a just price, for instance, and whether you're allowed to charge interest as it is based on God's law, or as it is based on some form of notion of what is the nature of the thing according to an Aristotelian tradition. So it's like a vertical dictate how we must behave. And then when we come to Locke, for instance, and the beginning of the liberal tradition, it is no longer a vertical dictate, but it is now things like a social contract, which might be a horizontal dictate, that how you are behaving, how you are acting is now determined not by some higher authority, but is determined by, and it will become that, the institutions that are created by humans. It is the things that are decided on by social convention, let us say. And so it is in this context that we look at the physiocrats. But the physiocrats, I've just got something there. I've got to pull that up. Okay, let me see if I know how to do that. I'm not going to give you a long slideshow because I can't do this. Can you see my screen?
No.
You
No,
can't.
sir.
Okay, and I can't
No, you
see my
can't.
screen either. I can't even see. Okay, let me try that again.
You can upload the presentation to the group chat as well, and we can look along with it if the screen sharing doesn't sort itself out.
Okay, you still, I'll try either. Can you see something now?
Yes,
I
we can
guess.
see your screen.
Oh, you can, okay. Well, I'm not going to give you a long slideshow because I fail at this. I've worked hours on something. I didn't make much headway. And I didn't want to just start with Descartes. I wanted to say something about the physiocrats. And physio, or well, what it means, physiocracy, it's really derived from the Latin. It means the rule of nature. The physiocrats called themselves les économistes. It's the first time that the expression economists was used. But later, as the term economists became more current, the physiocrats, the group of people that we'll be talking about now, were referred to as physiocrats because they placed so much emphasis on the rule of nature. Now, I don't want to look at my screen. I mean, let's see how I get rid of this. Okay, well, let's stick to the screen for the moment. We've got to clarify what is meant by the rule of nature. The most important figure there is that of François Quesnay. I think he was born 1690 sometime, and he died just before the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation. And I think in his presentation, on Hume, Chessery mentioned that Smith wanted to dedicate the Wealth of Nations to Hume, who passed away before the publication. But he also wanted Smith also at some point at least had planned to dedicate it to Quesnay, François Quesnay, because he was very influenced by the ideas of the physiocrats, and he had spent many years in France, especially in Paris, and in the company of people like Quesnay and other physiocrats. What we want to say about Quesnay at this point is that he was a great admirer of Descartes. And in the video that you've watched last time, I hope, on Descartes, you would have realized that, it's really an important figure. Some have called Descartes as the father of modern philosophy. And certainly in terms of the hypothetical deductive approach, he would have been considered as having played in sort of the person that we associate with the hypothetical deductive method. Let's just look very briefly at some aspects of Descartes, okay? Because this is going to be important for some of the work that's coming up later, and that's being done at present in late in economics. One part of his method is sort of, or the fourth point of his method, we don't have to get stuck in detail too much, is that accept as true only that. Can you see me typing as I'm typing there?
Yes, I can see
Yes.
you.
You can, okay. Accept as true only that which is so clear and distinct that there is no occasion to doubt it. Sorry, this is easier done on the blackboard. Oh, well, it's there a few times. This is easier done on the blackboard than on this. Accept, Astriani, that which is so clear and distinct that there is no occasion to doubt it. Okay. And we just got to look at that briefly, because that is so important to our approach to economic thinking at the present. So what is an example of clear and distinct? So that notion of clear and distinct is important. And what he's saying is that that which is clear and distinct, I cannot doubt it. It's got to be true. And so if we put that in the context of his saying that we remembered from last time, what did he say about, what did we say is sort of the little phrase that is so important to our remembering what Descartes is all about? What is his phrase there?
I think, therefore I am.
I think, therefore I am. Okay, I'm back on screen, am I?
Yes, you are.
I think, therefore I am. And it's like, okay, it's you know, he's looking at why you cannot doubt that you're alive, so you can't doubt it. And it's so clear and distinct. Well, you know, you can't doubt it, because logic would prevent you from doubting it, as we saw that last time. And so that creates the idea that that we also have clarity and distinction as to what is meant by life. So let's just look at example. What would be an example of an idea that is clear? And what he meant by an idea that is clear is one that really, if we were to be Hume, we would be say it's true by definition. It's like you don't need empirical evidence for that. 2 + 2 is 4. It's clear. That's what it is. If you're telling the truth, it's clear that you cannot lie. That you're not lying. So it's as if these things that are clear are logical truths, if you like. And then what would you understand by something that is distinct? I mean, it's what is distinct? Give me an example of something that is distinct.
I would say I am distinct from somebody else.
Very good. Yes, I am. I am. You. Every individual is distinct from everybody else. Numerically, you are different, and that is really, to a large degree, what he means by that. Numerically different, and so Descartes, like Hobbes, was a great admirer of the proofs in geometry. And the best example of what is distinct are always numbers, because 1 is distinct from the number 2, distinct from the number 3. And you as an individual, well said, are distinct from every other individual. And every pen, okay, is distinct from every other pen. And so if you were to think of having to classify Descartes as a nominalist and a realist, where would you put him?
As a nominalist?
You'd put him as a nominalist. Okay, you'd put him as a nominalist. And we may have to elaborate on that. And so you can see the emphasis there is on the individual things. It's beginning to be on numbers, things which are individually separate from each other. What would be, I mean, the opposite of distinct I mean, we could look at distinct. It's a bit like digital versus analog. What is digital? Give me an example of digital. If you hear the expression digital, what image does it conjure up for you? Yes, Chesri.
I think that even analog stuff is distinct.
Well,
rather than distinct. I mean, real numbers are all distinct from each other, but are also infinitely dense. Versus digital stuff.
We're losing you there. I mean,
used for different things.
I didn't hear most of what you were saying because of, I'm not sure if that was the case for the others. So do you want to try repeat that?
So I think that if two things are distinct, it means that one can tell the one thing from the other thing, and
yes,
one can tell that they're different. Digital stuff is discrete. There's like unit differences between each thing. But you can have analog things which are also discrete. Something can be continuous and also distinct, I think, is what I'm saying.
Okay, well, that's very good. I mean, you know, it's like, you know, you've got this idea of continuous. A body, if you like, a body is continuous because there's, you know, it's like there really is no beginning and no end. And what I was trying to get at is that, you know, when you look at digital, it's either on or off, it's yes or no. And very often, you know, what is analog is by gradation. And I like the fact that Chesri used a distinction between that which is discrete and that which is by gradation. What is our thoughts? Ponder this for a moment. Is your thought discrete at like a number, or is it continuous? That's a heavy philosophical question, huh?
Isn't it both?
You'd say it's both. I don't know. You know, I'm of the view that it's discrete. You can have one thought only at one time. At least I haven't, you know, I guess I haven't succeeded to have more than two thoughts at the same time. And so you've got one following another. How many thoughts a day do we on average have as human beings?
Probably innumerable.
Just about, yeah. Apparently it's something like 50,000. You know, we stuff our brains full of stuff, and it's all worthless most of the time, isn't it?
Yeah.
Except when you do economics, okay. But these are like, these are like, they're counting them, you know, they're trying to count them. At least psychologists and psychiatrists, and they come up with those numbers like 50,000. Well, it seems to be something that's countable that would make it discrete, and that would make it distinct, if you like. I thought it's something distinct. And then if Descartes says only that which is clear and distinct, you know, that it is so clear and distinct that it cannot be doubted, then we accept it as truth. What would be something that would be opposed to distinct? I guess it would be many of the words that we use, that the meaning varies with many shades, but we can still nail down those meanings. But it's much of our thinking is by analogy. Okay, I'm not sure if I used the example previously. If I say I've got to carry my cross, the meaning of that, who wants to explain the meaning of a sentence like I've got to carry my cross? And I don't mean literally carrying a cross on my back. I mean it in a different sense. What does that expression mean? Yes.
I think it means
Mpumelelo.
that life is ripe with suffering, and that each one has a burden to carry.
All right. So you've got like you got metaphors, and you have, it is like a cross that you carry. You've got your burden, you got your hardship. You got to just accept it, embrace it if you can, if possible. And it's also what would be called thinking by analogy. All right. We're looking at ourselves in analogy to Jesus carrying the cross, for instance. And so it's that sort of thinking that the new approach that we see emanating with Descartes is trying to reject that. We don't think in terms of metaphors and analogies. We think in terms of that which is clear and distinct. Okay, but of course there's a danger in that. If you go back to the example of Descartes, he says, well, it is clear and distinct, and I know that I'm alive. I cannot doubt it. It's clear and distinct. He's talking as if we have a clear and distinct idea of what it means to be alive. What is life? Because it's not all that clear what life is. It's a question I'm putting to you, and all I get is silence. But if I were, if you put the question to the biologists who study life, there's a lot of silence as well. And those who want to, but of course, biologists would want to explain what is life in material terms, and what would they possibly say? They would say, it reminds me of something that one of Mpumelelo, in a sense, was asking on the WhatsApp. Life is just chemicals. Is that true? That is really. There's a book that came out not long ago by a biologist saying that, life. The life. What is life? And then the subtitle is that something to do with the chemical base of life or something. Anyway, he's trying to reduce life to chemicals. But is that all? Anyway, I'm departing too far from where I want to be, but we're looking at the trend of the philosophy from Aristotle to Aquinas, and then we get this big change with Descartes. And we are still in that tradition that is part and parcel of Descartes. And to a degree, very often, we by the simplistic methodology of Descartes, we may be misled, because we only look at that which is clear and distinct, basically looking at what is quantifiable, we dismiss as uninteresting anything that is not quantifiable. Isn't that what we do in economics? That's why we say, well, faith, there's no faith anyway. The only thing that exists are human beings who pray or don't pray, or go to church or do not go to church. And so we, in a sense, this approach, when we only look at method, as Descartes tells us to, that it's, don't engage with metaphysics. And like Hobbes, he tried to basically displace Descartes. Don't engage in metaphysical terms like faith. Don't even talk about it. There is no such thing, though he was a believer. Our tradition now is, well, in following Descartes, is that, it's not clear and distinct, and everything relating to faith as such cannot be about truth, is only about speculation, and not really part of the scientific endeavor. so Quenet was influenced by Descartes, and when we'll talk about what is the meaning of nature by Quenet as we go along. Quenet is very important for us because did I pull up the screen now, or did I just put it up for myself? I just pulled it up for myself. Okay. I'm trying to pull that up again, see if I can do that. Do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So Quenet is now following the tradition of Descartes, and so we'll get back to Descartes later as we discuss what Quenet is saying. Quenet really developed the first model in economics, and it's this thing here called the tableau économique. It's really the first model, and it, in a sense, follows the line of Descartes, if you like. Let me just say a few words about Quenet and his statements about, you can see me again, right? Okay, you can see me again. He's the man that introduced the idea of laissez-faire to economics. Him and the physiocrats, that's where it emerged. It looks like it came from Quenet, the first person to do so. And but Quenet was a medical doctor. But his approach to medicine is really quite a modern approach. He was saying that the body is able to heal itself. It doesn't need intervention by the doctors. That was at a time when surgeons and doctors were very sort of interfering in their approach. They had something that was called bloodletting. If you let blood and you then at the right places, you'd be able to heal the patient. And he was against that approach, and he was against bloodletting, and actually said that no, the body's able to heal itself quite well. And therefore, his approach to medicine, to medical intervention, with regard to his patients, had been an approach of laissez-faire. He was saying, let nature take its course. The human body, it's nature that's working. It's been designed in a way that it can heal itself. And well, he was successful in this approach. And then he became famous, and he was the doctor to the mistress of the King of France, or rather the regent of France, in the 1740s. So Quenet was born in the 1690s, as I said. He lived until 1774. In the 1740s or 50s, he was already quite famous. I've uploaded 2 items on Sakai, the one by Foley and the other one by Mirovsky, that detail this portion of the history, where Quenet is what brought him to become famous in not only in medicine, but what brought him to become famous in economics and economic circles. And so those, the one reading is rather long, but it's interesting. The other one by Mirovsky is a bit shorter, but it's like, because he had now become famous in medicine, as a surgeon, as a doctor, as an internist, he then had an incredible break, namely the son of the regent. The regent isn't the king, but he's standing in as king until the king-to-be is old enough to be king. Anyway, the son of the regent fell ill, and he was going to die, all the doctors that he had seen, they just made it worse. And then the mistress of the region said, well, try Quenet. And Quenet took on that son as a patient, and the approach he took was that of laissez-faire, his usual approach to the healing of the body. And by adopting the approach of laissez-faire, what he did, he tried to create conditions for the body to heal itself, rather than bloodletting or doing other serious interventions. He just helped the body along. And well, that son of the regent, he became well, and the king, very excited, now gave him a, basically as a sign of thanks, gave him a big piece of land, a huge estate. And so now Quenet, the doctor, becomes an estate holder, an estate owner, and he manages the estate on what principles? On the principles on laissez-faire. Don't interfere with nature, help it along, but don't interfere with it. And that's when he got into what we would now call economics. Being already famous, he was in all the right circles in Paris, in the salons, and so he now started talking about not only the management of estates, but he was also talking about the management of the economy as a whole. And just as the state ought to be managed like the body in terms of laissez-faire, so the state is to be managed in terms of laissez-faire, and the economy is to be managed in terms of laissez-faire. My dog is barking. One moment. So he's taking that idea of laissez-faire from medicine, from the treatment of the body to the estate, and then to the management of the economy. And I mean, isn't that extraordinary? We've got this expression laissez-faire, which is so important in economic thought, at least from that time onwards, even today. I'm sure anybody not familiar with the expression of laissez-faire? If not, raise your hand. So there you go. You're all familiar with the expression laissez-faire. And it's so important in economics. And when you hear laissez-faire, you will immediately think, oh, economics, an approach to economics. You will think of classical liberalism. You will think of free trade. You will think of no government intervention, and it's like, it's like a cornerstone in our teaching of economics. And where does it come from? What is its basis? It's a metaphor taking from medicine by Quenet. All right, and so that is really the genesis of that very important expression in economic thought, and I find it quite mind-boggling that it's come to us in this particular way. And so if you want to read up more on that, look at those two articles by Mirovsky. It's a shortened sort of discussion of it, and by Foley, which is very long, but it gives you details that help explain what I'm pulling up now. And I'm pulling up this tableau économique, which means the economic table. All right, and in this economic table, okay, in this economic table, the assumptions that we are making, and it's a model, okay? So we're talking about assumptions. And the assumptions that we are making until, let me see, I'm not quite ready with this. Am I back on? I'm back on. And the assumptions that he is making are the following, and to a degree it's more than just assumptions, but firstly, he looked at the economic situation of France at the time, and we're looking at 1750, 1740, 1750, 1760, and it was economically a very, very bad period. I mean, those of you who, there was a one of the videos was on John Law. John Law, sort of, you know, the first man to have a bank that is based on a modern type of bank that's based on money creation, where you fractional reserve banking, where you create money, but you only keep a fraction of the value of that you create by issuing money. Only a fraction of that is kept in terms of bullion or coins. Anyway, France was in a terrible state, and it was alleviated for a short time by John Law's banking system that was introduced. But when that collapsed, so go back to that video on John Law, when that collapsed, France fell back to a very miserable economic situation. And the reason for that was quite simple. It was oppressive towards the farmer. It was excessively oppressive in that, just one moment. It was a very oppressive system. For instance, the only people that were required to pay tax in France at the time were really the farmers, and the taxes were extremely high. The farmers and the artisans and the merchants, but the richest portions, the richest parts of society, namely the nobility, the landowners, the owners of the land, did not have to pay tax. And the clergy, the church, did not have to pay tax. And so the French king, you might recall names like Louis, the Sun King, Louis XIV, Louis XV. You may know that Louis XVI, at the time of, okay, what happened to Louis XVI? Anybody know anything about that? What end did he find?
He was beheaded by guillotine.
Thank you very much. He was beheaded by guillotine because at the French, you know, eventually it was so bad that eventually there was the French Revolution that got rid of the French nobility, most of it anyway. And so we're looking at that period, the 20 years, the physiocratic period, the 30 years, 30, 40 years before the French Revolution. And of course, the French Revolution came about because things were so difficult, and they were really difficult on the farming community, and so France, relative to England or Holland, was impoverished. Its population was much larger than that of England, but it was impoverished because there was so much. Well, obviously, let's just go back to that. It's a matter of going back to Colbert. Remember the video on, there's something on Colbert, the French Minister of Finance of the 1600s. It was full of regulation. All aspects were being regulated, but it was mostly oppressive towards the farmers. And so Quenet and his followers thought that, well, if the French economy is to be saved, something has to be done, something drastically has to be done. Amongst the things to be done, something would have to be done about this oppressive regime, about this excessive regulation of the economy, and especially something has to be done about what's happening to the farming sector. And so what he said is that, well, if you look at it, what is productive? What produces? I mean, what is most productive? It's nature, which is incredibly productive. We can live without in a lockdown. We can live without going to movies. We can live without going to parties. We can live without car. But what is the one thing you will always need? You will need food. You will need the plenty created by nature. Nature is what is bringing about our nutrition. Nature is also what is giving us all the materials that we need for everything that we manufacture: iron, petrol, wood. And so what he said is, well, what is really that which is productive is only agriculture. It's only not only agriculture, but that which is related to nature. Nature is productive. And so what he did, he separated the economy into 3 parts, and that's become common ever since. If you look at Marx, you look at the different classes. You've got the capitalists. You've got the land owning class, basically the nobility and so forth, and then you've got the working class. And so the presidents of that are found in the work of Quenet, where he looks at, well, the 3 classes. The land owning class, they just own the land. They don't even pay taxes. They don't even work the land. They rent it out to the farmers. And so that is the second class, the farmers. And then he looked at the third class being the artisans, those who manufacture goods or those who provide services, butlers and the like for the rich folks. And so he introduced this 3-class society idea. And let me pull up my. Was I sharing? What are you seeing at the moment?
A slide?
Oh, okay. It wasn't. I don't see a slide. So let me see what. Oh, is that the slide you're seeing? Like a very complicated slide.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry. I thought you saw me. So, but did you see that complicated slide? That is the tableau économique. Okay, that's our first model in economics. And so he assumed those 3 classes. Let's call them the farmers, the landowner, and what is the third class?
The artisans.
The artisans. Okay, I call them artisans, but the expression that he used was that of the sterile class. Okay, not that they, the sterile in French. It's like, obviously it's the same word in French as it in English, but it's just emphasizing the fact that they are not productive in the way that nature is. Nature can produce, and what it does, it produces a surplus. It's where we get in Marxist economics, you've got that idea of surplus, which is very important. And Quenet says, well, we've got a surplus which is created by nature in the farming sector. And the artisans are not creating a surplus. The only thing that artisans do is that they are converting what is produced by nature. So if an artisan is working wood, if he's a carpenter, then he's just converting that which was produced by nature. And that is, the initial reason why they were called the physiocrats, because they're saying only nature is productive. And so in his model, this is now a model, okay? He says the landowner in this model, and as we would have read by Hobbes, remember Hobbes is saying that we put our assumptions and our definitions at the beginning, and this is really what is being done here, laying down all the assumptions and our definitions, and important is that the landowner, let's say he's got 2,000, the expression he used was leave, let's call it pounds, he's got 2,000 pounds, but he received that money as rent from the farmers. And where do the farmers get it from? They get it from nature. Nature is producing more food than the farmer needs to sustain himself. Is that right? So that's the basic idea. And that surplus is coming from nature, being able to produce more than is required by the farming sector to sustain itself. That finds itself as wealth to the landowner in the form of rent, who's got 2,000 pounds. And so that goes from the farmer to the landowner as rent. Now, one of the other assumptions that he makes is that its rate of return is 100%. In other words, if the farmer invests 1,000 pounds into seeds and into labor to produce agricultural output, if he invests 1,000 pounds, then the rate of return is 100%. It produces produces an excess of another 1,000. And that's how the surplus is being created. Produit net means net product. Any questions up to this point? And so the assumptions then is, in this model, is that the landowner is going to spend those 2,000 pounds and he can spend it on artisans. And by assumption, he assumes that half of it is spent on artisans, the work of artisans, the sterile class, the trinkets. Later, Smith is going to talk about trinkets and things like that. Services, butlers, coaches, fancy clothing, wigs. I mean, think of that period, the French aristocracy with its gowns and wastage, what have you. I mean, that the government, the French treasury was always bankrupt. I mean, literally bankrupt all the time. And half of that rent which is received, the landowner is spending on the output produced by the farmers. Right, so that would be food or wood for burning and what have you. And by assumption, we are saying that it produces a profit. We say the rate of return is 100%, and therefore what profit or what surplus is generated when the landowner spends 1,000 pounds on. Sorry, when the farmer receives from the landowner 1,000 pounds, and he called it an advance, which they're using in the form of seeds and doing whatever is and fertilizers and whatever is required, doing whatever is required to grow food, then what surplus is being produced if 1,000 is being invested, so to say, into the farming sector? What quantity of surplus? What monetary value? We assumed 100%, right? So what surplus is being created?
Can you please repeat the question?
Okay. If the landowner spends £1,000 on the farmers, and the farmers use the £1,000 to grow food, to plant seed, to put fertilizer, to work the land, then the 1,000, so then the £1,000 is like invested into nature, into land, into agricultural production, and according to Cornet in his model, that will produce a surplus or a net product of 100%. So that would be producing a surplus of 1,000. Are you okay with that? It's by assumption, okay? And the thing about the model is that when we change assumptions, we come up with policy recommendations, and that is what is making this model interesting for us. But just to go through this model now, and it's always confusing when you encounter it. I've given you on Sakai, I've put this chapter by Riemer, Ingrid Riemer, which is in a sense the most accessible. And it's called the zigzag model, not necessarily just the tableau économique, but also the zigzag model. And I'm just trying to make you understand the zigzag model. You know, this sort of, if you look at past exams, the zigzag model appears a lot because you know, it's a sort of thing that as I explain it, it makes sense, and maybe you don't have any questions, but later when you got to work through it yourself, you wonder what the hell is going on here. But well, anyway, what's going on here is this: as the farmer is receiving £1,000 from the landowner, he is spending half of that, and that's again by assumption. Okay, don't ask me why. Okay, it's just there. You know, that's by assumption. The value could be different, but the assumption here is 50%. It makes our calculations easy, but we can change the assumptions, and it's got interesting implications. So we are saying that he's using half of that 1,000 to buy from the artisans. He's going to buy implements which he uses in farming, shovels, and he made clothing and what have you. Okay, so that's by assumption. And the other 500 Rand, he spends how? The farmer would spend how?
On the class, on his own class of farmers.
On himself, on his own class of farmers. That's right, you know, buying food from other farmers or using up some of it that he's produced himself. And it's not just necessarily farmers, but it's everything related to nature. So also mining, extraction, forestry, the proceeds from hunting and fishing. So half of that he will spend on, again, on that class to which he is part himself. And so what the zigzag traces is what happens in terms of this green line. These £1,000 are spent on the output by artisans. The artisans, by assumptions, are also spending 50% on the agricultural sector to purchase food, to buy fish, to buy wood, to buy iron ore, silver, whatever they require in order to produce what they're producing. And so the 500 of the 500 they received, they're spending 250 on the farmers, on the output produced by the farmers. And what do they spend the other 250 on?
Their own class of artisans, trinkets.
Again, okay, so you got it. So they will spend the remaining 250 rand on their fellow artisans or on services, anything that is non-agricultural, non-extractive, and so that continues. Where again, the farmer has got 250, which was spent on him by the artisans. He's using half of that to buy the output of artisans. And so we've got, what is that? That's a zigzag model, right? It looks like zigzag, and it's like a circular flow model. In Economics 1, you would have been introduced to the circular flow model. And that's really the circular flow that we've got, the first circular flow model, and it's been presented in different ways. And that's another reason why obviously this is very important to the history of economic thought, because it's really the beginning. It's the first circular flow model, and we could present it differently, and then it would really look like the circular flow model that you would have encountered in your Economics 1. And so we've got the money that's flowing through the economy. Now, let me just, before I continue, relate this. Let me just relate this again to what he says about nature. What he's doing there is he's saying this is, I mean, not only is, and he uses the expression of the rule of nature, not only because nature is producing this, but he says that he draws a metaphor, and that's Quenet, okay? He's making a metaphor from the medical fields, and what had been discovered 100 years earlier was in medicine, they discovered, somebody by the name of Harvey discovered what happens to blood. You know, I mean, before that, we didn't really know that it's the heart that's pumping the blood through our body. And so he's looking at this economy the way he had been taught as a surgeon, as a doctor. What happens to blood, to the blood in our human body? What happens to the blood in our human body? Well, it circulates through the body. You've got blood going out. It's going out through the arteries. And then you've got blood coming in. It's coming in through the veins. And it's all happening at the heart. And on top of that, you've got really two distinct circles that the blood is taking. One is, I mean, from the level of your thorax, your chest here, from a bit below, you can't see, you know, somewhere there. You've got a stream. You've got one bloodstream that's going up to the brain and bringing blood and oxygen to the brain, and then everything else goes through another system, which is bringing blood and oxygen to all the other parts of the body. And so what he's saying is saying, oh, well, look at it again, nature at work. What is the economy? The economy is like a body. It's got, instead of having circulation of blood from the arteries with the oxygen and then back through the veins back to the heart, he's saying, well, the same thing happens in the economy. It's going from the productive sector. You've got two flows. You've got a flow of goods and you've got a flow of money. And it's going from the productive sector to the unproductive sector. And so that's what he tried to capture in You were still seeing my screen, right? You were still seeing this thing here. Sorry, I thought you were seeing me. Okay, so he's saying, well, that's the circular flow that we've got in the body of for blood. You've got that circular flow in the economy from the productive to the non-productive sector, and then it flows back to the productive sector. And so this carries on. I'm not sure if you can see. Okay, what would be what? Okay, you can see the last value that I've got here is 67.5. What is the number that's going to appear here? I'm just testing if anybody's out there because I can't see anybody. If I put up
33.75.
And why doesn't it come up? There we go, 33.75. Thank you very much. Okay, and then, but the same applies to the money that the landowner spends on the artisans. 50% of what he spent will go to the artisans, right? That's £1,000. The artisan will spend half of that on the output by the agricultural sector. That's £500. And from there it will circulate back into the, it will circulate again back to itself. Half of it spent on the output by the agricultural and mining sector, and half on the sterile class, the output produced by the sterile class. And so it will carry on. And so you've got a really, there's we're just representing two zigzags, depending on where it starts, but it's zigzagging around, it's circulating all the time. And just as we are only presenting two zigzags of an initial 2000, so it will be multiplied by all the expenditure that is made in the economy. And so we've got an overall macroeconomic, you know, this is just a model and illustration of what happens throughout the economy. This is just looking at what happens to these £2,000 spent by the landowners, and it's going through the economy in this particular manner. Okay, if we now look at it, can you see what I do to my cursor?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, if we want to, if we add up those values, what value are we approaching?
$8,000.
How much?
8,000.
1,000.
Or you mean
1,000.
Sorry, I couldn't hear the second one.
2,000.
2,000. Okay, so it approaches 2,000. If this were to carry on, it would add up to 2,000. And well, that is interesting because remember here, we started off with 2,000. And we see that at the end of the day, 2,000 will then be the total expenditure on the agricultural sector. And we keep in mind that the agricultural sector is productive at a rate of 100%. So we'll get back to that in a moment. Let's first go to the other side. What does that add up to? Also 2,000. Okay, it approaches 2,000. So now we got to go back to this idea of the surplus. And let me just talk about that a little bit. You can see me, right? No, you can't. Now you can see me. That surplus, it's really interesting, and that's what it's all about, because what he wants to illustrate is this idea of nature being at work. If you let nature take its course, it's gonna, in a sense, it can reproduce itself. We just got to give it the environment that allows it to reproduce itself effectively. But it can take care of itself. Now, we saw that at the beginning, the landlord received rent of £2,000. And that £2,000 is the surplus that was created by the productive sector, okay, the agricultural sector. Now we're saying that at the end of the cycle of spending of the £2,000 by the landlord, we end up really by seeing that a total of £2,000 will be spent on the agricultural sector. And if £2,000 is spent on the agricultural sector, then what is the total surplus produced by the agricultural sector?
$4,000?
Well, 4,000 is the total produced by the agricultural sector. That is correct.
2,000.
Correct. So it's 2,000 as a surplus and 2,000 which had been invested and used up. And so the agricultural sector effectively produces an output of 4,000, 2,000 of which it is spending on itself to keep it going. But on top of that, it's producing 2,000 which it can pay as rent to the landlords. I mean, later Keynes is going to refer to the landlords as nothing but the rentier who earns a rent for doing nothing. And that's what's being illustrated here by our model from Quenet. So if we just go, do I have to go through? Did I pull up that screen again, the table?
Yes.
Okay, so now we get into the meat of this thing here, because now what the model wants to show is that nature is such that it is able to, the economy is able to reproduce itself. And that notion of reproduction of course becomes very important to Marxist economics later. But we just got to show that quickly. On that expenditure by artisans on the landlords, sorry, on the farmers, it's producing a surplus, all right? So that yellow line is always the surplus. It's producing a surplus of 500. And the expenditure of 250 on the landlords, on the farmers here, produces a surplus of 250. All right, and so it carries on. Every expenditure on the farming sector, agricultural sector, is productive of a surplus, 100% surplus, which means it adds up to how much at the bottom there?
Also 2,000.
Thousands. And so we're starting off at the end point here is the same that we started off. The end point being that there is a surplus created of 2,000 by the farming sector, and the farming sector has paid over the 2,000 to the landowners, and so the whole circle will start again. Can you see what is meant by it's reproductive, it regenerates itself? It is also, if you like, it's in equilibrium, okay, because it can carry on like this, or given those assumptions. And so it is reproductive. we've got the surplus, we've got the economy sustaining itself. We see like the blood in the body, we've got the flow of money and goods through the economy, and it's going on beautifully. And so what he says is, well, what do we take from that? Apart from what I've already mentioned, is that what are the implications of that? We're saying this is like a model in economics, and of course the interesting thing would now be, before we go there, why do I only have a yellow line going from left to right, from left to the center, but no line from the artisans to the center?
The assumption is that the only productive class is the agricultural class, or the class that is productive in relation to its use of natural resources.
Thank you very much. It's by assumption, namely that only the agricultural sector is productive. And later, when we get to Adam Smith, we will see that, you know, Adam Smith will, and of course, the model that the physiocrats would be criticized for that assumption. You know, it's a bit strong to say only the agricultural sector is productive. I mean, human beings are part of nature as well. They can also produce value. And so the physiocrats are being criticized for that. And Adam Smith himself does criticize them for that, but then he says that, well, you know, what he counts as productive, and we will see what his rationale is, what he counts as productive is basically everything that, you know, everything except services. But what would be, one moment. Today for us, economists and non-economists in our society, what, you know, if you talk about somebody or something being productive of value, I mean, did you watch that video on Turgot, where the last quotation says that, who gave the presentation on Turgot? I'm gonna pull it up. Look at this last sentence. Isn't that a beauty? It is not labor that is the cause of value. Can you see that?
No.
You can't. Okay, well, I've just gotta press here. Can you see now?
No, nothing yet.
Oh man, this is. Now you can, right?
Yes. Yes, we can see.
So that is who gave us the presentation here. It was Karabo.
Me,
Thank you very
Karabo.
much. And look at the beauty there at the end. It's not labor that is the cause of value, but value that attracts labor. And then, you know, the first one, respect. Okay, well, he's a Frenchman. You know, the Frenchmen like to. I've got my father-in-law. He's French, and they like to come with those beautiful expressions. And of course, this man is no exception. And there was a particular quote on Hume, which are those of you who watched the video on Hume. What did he say? He said something about beauty, right? I don't have that ready to look at, but the presentation on Hume, who did the presentation on Hume?
I did the presentation on you, Jacques.
Okay, Jacques, okay. Can you just read us the very last sentence?
Okay. Beauty in things exists in the mind which contemplates them.
Beauty and things exist in the mind which contemplates them. So if I'm going to ask you the question, is in terms of our earlier discussions that we've had, a statement like that, beauty and mind exist in the mind which beauty, whatever, you get my drift. Beauty exists in the mind that perceives. Is from our division between realism and nominalism, is Hume with a sentence like that, is he a realist or a nominalist? Tumelo. Any volunteers? Yes. Okay. The expression that he's a what? He's not a realist. No, he's not. Okay, I mean, it becomes complicated because Hume, we heard and we saw, like Locke, is an empiricist. They may claim to be realistic, but they're not realist they're not classical realists like Aristotle. Because what is he saying? He's saying there's no such thing like beauty out there, beauty in the things, beauty as a form, a Platonic form, or beauty in things as maybe Aristotle would be saying. But he's saying beauty doesn't exist. Beauty is just a matter of the mind, what you put onto it. And so an expression or word like beauty itself is a metaphysical thing, because and debates about it are worthless, not scientific, because it is not something that exists in a sense that it's not a universal, that where things share something in common, which allows us to call all of these instances in beauty. No, it's the mind that creates our notion of beauty as we look at things. So that's an example of a nominalist at work. I'm just pointing this out for you to see how, once you get a feel of the difference there, you can start placing certain authors and the theories that they are producing in these type of categories. And then what else they're saying will flow quite easily in terms of, if this is their starting point, what are they likely to say about other matters, whether they be economic matters or non-economic matters. So now let's get back to our model in economics. And what would happen if, where are we? What would happen if the landowner, you can see that, right? If the landowner were to spend more money on the agricultural sector and less money on the artisans? You can still see my screen, right?
Will it not create more surplus?
Thank you. It will create more surplus. The figure here of 2000 is going to increase. the value there will decrease, okay, because we're starting at instead of 1,000, we'd be starting at 800 or 500. Here it will be less, but here it will be more. But this is the farming sector is the only sector that produces a surplus. Therefore, if we get this value here, okay, I mean, if for me to illustrate what I mean, if this were to be 1,500 and this were to be 500, you could then go through this and do your own calculation and determine what will be the end value here. Now, we don't have to do that, but we know that this figure is going to be more than 2,000, and therefore the surplus is going to be more than 2,000, right? And therefore, what has happened to the wealth of the nation?
Increased?
It has increased. It's so you know, wealth of the nation is increased not by accumulating bullion, but there's the answer, the physiocrats' answer to the mercantilist. The wealth of the nation is increased by investing money, by investing into your productive sector, which is the farming sector, into agriculture. You're gonna, okay, for now, we're not talking about the distribution. You know, it's not nice that it's all going to the landowners as rent, but the wealth has increased because now at least the landowners are becoming more wealthy and the farming sector can sustain a greater proportion of farmers or greater number of farmers. So that's how the wealth of a nation is increased. Rather than by the mercantilist ideas. What would happen if, okay, we're going back to our original position. That's too far. What would happen if instead of the farmers paying taxes, the landowners have to pay taxes? I mean, it's not necessarily there for you to see and calculate in the model the way I've portrayed it there. But just if you think about it, what answer would we give to the question? What is the impact of reducing the tax burden on which is being imposed on the farmers?
The net output would increase. As a result, there would be less burden from the productive side of the economy.
Thank you very much. Less of the money that they've got, that the farmer has available, instead of paying it over to the government, to the king, it will be reinvested. It's available to be put back into the land. And as it is being put into the land, you know, that would, let's take, you know, if we were to illustrate it, we would say, okay, well, that's going to make it possible for really, I mean, it's not consistent with the numbers that we've got there, but if you were to reduce the burden on the farmer, they would be able to spend more money on themselves, on seeds and what have you, and as they're able to produce more money sorry, that should have been, it was initially at 1,000. That's where we were. Now we might change it to 2,000. It would, because they don't have to pay the taxes, they would therefore have more money to spend, to invest into agriculture, and that entire value chain here, okay, the surplus generated would increase equally. I don't know, it would possibly go to 3,000. And then the landowner still has got 3,000 available as a surplus. But now look, everybody benefits, because now the artisans still has still has, you know, that the value here will be more than 2,000, the value there will be more than 2,000. And so by changing the tax scheme, the tax regime, the whole economy would be able to benefit from this. Any questions on that?
I have a question. You said that if there was more money given to the farmers, or those that are engaged in the extraction of natural resources or working with nature, that there would be an increase in net output. But it seems that predicated on the assumption that the economy is a closed one, the agricultural output there would be less demand from the artisans, because the artisans have less income to buy from the farmers. So what would then follow should be an agricultural depression as a result of there being a dwindled market from the artisans if more money is given to the agricultural sector.
Okay, I mean, you know, that is something one would now have to think about, how, you know, how precisely, how secure this model is. I think it would now be a matter of going through with it. You know, I mean, that's an exercise that you might want to endeavor to see what happens to this model if we change this from, you know, let's say we change it to something like this and you play it out like that. You're saying that, well, since you know, more money is being there, they're producing more output. But remember, the greater output is occasioned because the landowner is from the beginning spending more on the agricultural sector. And so as they're spending more on the agricultural sector, they are absorbing what would potentially be the glut, because what the landowner is spending more there absorbs the loss in spending by the artisans. It's really based on the idea that the artisans don't produce anything productive. To us, it sounds crazy, okay, from our modern perspective, but in terms of the assumptions that they've made, you would probably find that there will not be a glut. Instead, what they would want to show is that there's going to be a new, you use the expression of a self-enclosed system, and it will operate at a new equilibrium point with a new net product, but the distribution will be different. And so eventually, fewer people will be employed as artisans and more people will be employed as farmers. And that too, can you see, I'm not sure what you're seeing at the moment, I've lost track. I think you're still seeing my screen, that screen here. And that really was part of the argument of the physiocrats, because they're wanting to say that you know, the only way to save the French economy is to change the structure of it, because the structure of it at the time was with so much money by the landowners spent on warfare. Okay, you know, one of the things the money was spent on was warfare, because in that century there was a lot of war going on all the time, and the king was always in near bankruptcy. And then, of course, you know the story of possibly of Marie Antoinette at the time of the French Revolution. She said, well, if the people don't have bread to eat, give them cake. And that's illustrating the mentality and how the structure of the economy, where the agricultural sector was impoverished and the landowners who had the money but who didn't pay tax and the aristocracy and nobility that didn't pay tax was wasting money on fancy clothing, on coaches, on an extravagant lifestyle. You know, the Versailles Castle. I mean, if you go to the Versailles Castle, it's I haven't been there, but people who've been there tell me it's astounding. But the physiocrats said this is the heart of our problem. This is the very heart of our problem, the wastage of the land-owning class, of the nobility, on these non-productive things. And of course, what they had in mind at the time of the non-productive things is not only the output by artisans, or non-productive for surplus, but also expenditure on butlers and ladies that help the queen do her hairstyle, whatever. You know, I'm not familiar with this, but so that's part of the argument. And so their model would show that we got to change it structurally, making things easier for the farmers, because that's where production is coming from. What would we say today? About what is productive in an economy? What does production mean for us today? I mean, you know, if you look at somebody that is now actuarial scientists, or somebody that is baking bread, or somebody that's growing food, or somebody that is writing software for computers. I got the hand up by Mpumelelo.
To that question, you say that a service-based economy is a prosperous economy because of the value added from the services in the economy.
Right. I mean, well, we see that we certainly see that in service-based economies. That tourism. What is tourism? It's mostly just service-based, to a large degree service-based. I've got, you know, I know somebody who is in Bermuda. It's Bermuda. I mean, you know, it's got a population of 60,000, but it's wealthy because, you know, of course, that's where all the banking, all the illegal, you know, the illegally obtained money, or Panama City, it's rich because of the services that it provides. So, I mean, we can generalize that and say that today we count as productive everything that somebody is willing to pay for. That's our criteria for what is productive today. I mean, the physiocrats were saying only the agricultural output really is productive, everything else. But to the degree that where we are producing surpluses, we're producing profits and what have you, it's happening everywhere in the economy. And really, we count as somebody being as productive for as long as that person is being paid enough, not only to sustain himself or herself, but enough to reinvest, to have more, you know, more over than is required for sustenance and basically the surplus and the profit. Mpumelelo.
My question was it was in relation to nominalists, or is this statement when they say that if a tree falls in the forest, did it fall if no one was there? Is that a nominalist statement?
If the tree falls but nobody is there,
did it fall?
Okay, I mean, that is a question that only a nominalist would ask to begin with.
Okay.
Because for the realist, the answer is obvious. You know, it's that's what reality is about, and it exists independent of what we think of it. But you can also have nominalists who agree and say that, well, if the, you know, it would, but for the nominalist, it would, I mean, it's a question that both nominalists and realists may answer in the positive, in the affirmative, that it still fell. But certainly if you are saying like Bishop Berkeley did, that because nobody was there to hear it, then you are a certain type of nominalist. Namely, you're the nominalist that would be now subclassified as an idealist, that only the things in the mind are real. Okay. So to ask the question, in a sense, will be a question that will be asked from the nominalist camp. But the nominalist may affirm it and say, well, it still happened, even if nobody was there. But a certain group, a subgroup of nominalists would say that no, because it wouldn't, like Berkeley did, and you know, that's a famous example. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so in my culture, they normally say that I am because you are. So will that be put into the category of nominalism? Do you think?
Well, I mean, you know, a saying like that has many meanings, and the deeper meaning would, of course, be that we are only because we are together part of a society, that I cannot live independent of you. So from that perspective, at that level of meaning, it is affirming the value of society for each other. And now that would make it a realist view of, well, the importance of society to a degree. But you, of course, referring to the other level of meaning, which is saying that, which is taking that saying at face value, just the words, basically, I am because you, because of you, you know, I exist because you see me, type of thing. That would be, if you don't look at the deeper level of meaning, you might well believe that it's a nominalist attitude, because it's not saying that you exist independent as a person. You exist only because you, in a sense, you're being created by somebody else's seeing you. And so it's a question of how deep you want to go. And I think, you know, superficially it looks like it's a nominalist and idealist position. And even if it is an affirmation of society, that society exists, then it can be looked at differently.
Okay.
But I think just in terms of the way you asked the question, you're certainly on the right track in terms of understanding the distinction between the nominalism and realism. Should I do the following? There is it's a very difficult topic, but there's one very good text on this type of thing, and it's by somebody called Gilson, Etienne Gilson, and it's called The Philosophical Experience, the unity in the philosophical experience, something like this. I forgot. Should I put that on the reading on the general texts for those who have an interest in this to read up on?
From my side, I wouldn't mind.
You wouldn't mind? Okay, great. I'll put that up.
Yes, please, Professor.
All right. So what I'll do, I'll just have to dig for it, and then ideally, I'll do that after today's lecture, because if I don't, I might by tomorrow I might not get to do it for a long time again. But you see, I mean, I understand your question because it's confusing because it's so easily to mistake realism, classical philosophical realism, with being realistic. The empiricists want to be realistic, you know, they don't care about metaphysical ideas like beauty. And that, but you know, that's the, you know, that's the empiricists. But that doesn't mean just because they want to be realistic and be deal with quantities doesn't mean that they are classical realists. So in one of the essays that I received on the topic, one of you had watched a video on Locke and Hume, and that video was presenting Locke and Hume as realists, philosophical realists, you know, being part of the realism school. That's entirely wrong. You know, they want to be realistic in the tradition of Machiavelli, okay, if you like. What would those of you that have watched Machiavelli, the video on Machiavelli, what do we take from Machiavelli? Why is Machiavelli important to us in this course? Anybody?
Sorry, what was the question, Prof?
It was on Machiavelli. Okay, we're talking about the distinction between nominalism and realism and being realistic. And so we want to look at, you know, what, in terms of being realistic, what is Machiavelli's position, and why is of Machiavelli of interest to us? Okay, well, I'll answer that for you. I'm just checking if you're watching those videos, okay? Because most of the time the videos hone in on that which is important. And so we were interested in Machiavelli because he was saying, let's not look at what the ruler, the prince, the sovereign ought to do to be liked by his people. Let's be realistic and let's look at what the ruler has to do in order to survive, in order to remain in power. And that which he has to do is not virtuous. Quite the opposite. It may involve having to assassinate people and kill people and be brutal. And it's certainly from a religion-based basis, it's anything but good. It's evil deeds. And so Machiavelli is an important point for us because it's a departure from the tradition of Aristotle and Aquinas that are looking at this from the perspective of what is virtuous, what is good. A ruler should behave well. There should be an ideal government. What is the best form of government? It's plainly about what is needed in order for the ruler to remain in power, and that's important for us economists. We know we're looking at this, we're looking at economic sociology, whatever people are doing, politics, not from the perspective of what ought the leaders do, but from the perspective of what do they actually do. So when you look at politicians today, well, they will do what it takes for them to remain in power, isn't it? I mean, you look at the Chinese president, they changed the constitution. Putin is going to be in power for another 16 years. Mugabe was in power until his deathbed. And so, you know, that's how they really happen. That's how they really act. And this is what we're trying to do in economics. Let's look at what people, not what they ought to be doing, but let's rather look at what actually people are doing. And I'm saying it's in huge contrast, and I'm now referring you to the presentation on Aquinas. And again, I don't know why it happened like this. The last, I think it was on the last page. I'm going to look at all the last pages all the time of you. And of course, I mean, your presentations can be by PowerPoint or by, seeing your face. That's all great. But I wrote that down, that quotation by Aquinas. He says, three things are necessary for the salvation of man. Right, in the first place, what does salvation mean? What does salvation mean?
Saving.
Means what?
Saving.
Sailing. Oh, say again. Sorry. What does let me just write it for you, because sometimes my accent.
I was saying saving.
Saving, yeah, okay. You're being saved.
Deliverance as well.
Pardon?
I was saying
Deliverance.
deliverance.
Yeah, eternal life, right?
The opposite of condemnation.
The opposite of condemnation. Now, what would David Hume say about that? What would the nominalist say about condemnation and salvation? He'd say it's metaphysical.
That it either
Sorry,
doesn't
I
exist.
interrupted there.
I'm saying that it's either that it doesn't exist, or it should be facilitated for your own self-preservation.
That's right. Yes, I mean, it's, if it doesn't exist as a thing, it's, and if you are performing actions that in your own thinking facilitates your salvation, then that is just a rational decision making under uncertainty, because you want to stack things in your favor to being saved rather than being condemned. And then, but now the quotation that I'm reading from Aquinas, it says, three things are necessary for salvation. Know what he ought to believe. Man ought to know what he ought to believe. He ought to know what he has to desire, and he ought to know what he should do. That's the old school, all right? That's the school of Aristotle and Aquinas. And it's that ought, all right, what people ought to do. And Machiavelli comes around and says, throw it all out. There's no such ought. Let's be realistic and hard-nosed and look at what people actually are doing. And that's of interest to us in economics, because that's what we claim to be doing today in economics. We're looking not at, certainly when we get in our history of economic thought, we get to the work of Pareto and the like. It is avoid, as a scientist, we say we ought to describe what is the case, not what ought to be the case. So as a modern scientist, we would be saying that Aquinas is not scientific, whereas somebody like Machiavelli is scientific. Okay, so we can use that as a criteria to distinguish our modern notion of what it means to be scientific as opposed to non-scientific. I'm not saying you have to agree with it. I don't agree with it, but this is the sort of the dominant view. So I can just elaborate on that. Is that, of course, that that scientific view has certainly replaced the older views of Aristotle and Aquinas, and certainly has certainly the nominalism has displaced, or we talked about that, so I'm not going to repeat that. It's on video as well. The realism, it is of interest, okay, because what you're going to be writing a take-home exam. I don't know how to set take-home exams, but it's got to be questions that you cannot find the answer simply by looking at a book and copying the answer down. And so the questions that I have to be asking you in the exam, and I'm giving it some thought, okay? The question that I have to be asking you in the exam have to be broad questions where you start putting these things together. And so it might be something like, from your study of the history of economic thought, what was economics in the past at the time of Aristotle, Aquinas? What has it become at the time of Enlightenment? What is it now, and what is it likely to be in the future? Okay, it's, so those are big questions, and I'm not sure if I'm going to ask that I'm going to ask that question, but but it's certainly, given that you're going to take home exams, you got to know a lot of stuff in order to draw big pictures like that. Do you see where I'm driving at? And so, yeah, well, let's just finish off our physiocrats. Any question regarding the physiocrats up to now? And so we just got to briefly look at, of course, another way to ask the big question here is to relate it to the natural law philosophy, okay, the natural law discourse. If you go to the video on natural law, it's explaining to you what are the different meanings of the natural law, and then you would have to figure out, well, how do I fit the physiocrats in there? Because the physiocrats, they call themselves, it means the rule of nature. So what exactly do they mean by that? And then it's different from the meaning of that would have been attributed to a law of nature of somebody like Aquinas, the natural law. What Aquinas understood by the natural law is entirely different from what the physiocrats understand by the natural law. The physiocrats understand by the natural law something like the circulation of the blood system in our body. And then they're saying, okay, you just got to take hands off. Can you see where laissez-faire comes in? Take your hands off the circulation of goods and money. Don't have those restrictive taxes. Let's have a laissez-faire system where the economy can operate, the blood can flow freely. Every time when you impose a regulation, a tax, a tariff, import or export restriction, it's as if you are constraining the flow of blood. What's going to happen to the flow of blood to your hand if you constrain it there? Well, it's going to suffer. If some people, like, I don't know why they would want to do that, but people climb Mount Everest, and every year dozens of people die, and some of them survive, but because of the cold, the circulation of blood ceases to their feet, and when the circulation of blood ceases to the foot or to your fingertips, the fingertip dies off, the foot dies off, and you can cut off the toe. And so they're making that same argument with regard to natural law in their thinking, is that laissez-faire must be implemented so that nature, what is natural in the economy, can take its course, and that is more akin to an understanding of what is the nature of something, more akin to the approach of a Machiavelli rather than to an Aristotle or Aquinas. Machiavelli says, well, people do what they naturally do. And the physiocrats will be looking at, well, if they naturally do what they do, what happens? Let them do what they naturally do. And that's what we're doing today in economics as well. So let them do what they naturally do, and we're going to get some equilibrium. And so that is a very different understanding of the natural law of Aquinas or Aristotle. So, these are the sort of big questions that, some of the exam will be about. And you've just got to be able to put it together in a coherent fashion. And so it's important for you to read, to watch those videos, and like as you're doing anyway, you're asking questions for explanation and even expressing your disagreement. So that's great, because what we've got here are not individual stories or individual episodes in the history of economic thought. They are part of a process, they're part of an evolution. And our science, economics, isn't like the physical sciences where you establish one truth and it's established forever. What we really have, we have different approaches to the matter. And so not what is the case, but what is the approach? How do we look at our economic problems really is a much more interesting question than what is the case. I mean, if we want to just say what is the case, there isn't much we can say. We can't say that. In science you can say it's the case that that gravity is 9 point whatever kgf. But we don't have such a figure. The figure that we and that figure stays true forever. The numbers that we have are numbers like unemployment in South Africa is 26.5%. Okay, that's the case, but that changes tomorrow, and that changes, and that's different from 50 years ago. So what really is important is not statements of what is the case, but how do we deal with, what is our approach to the numbers that we see in front of us, and if we're looking at the numbers, and so that these big question of how things have changed, what has been the trend, is very important. But carry on for too long. Watch that video on Turgot to get an idea of Turgot. Turgot was fortunate to be the Minister of Finance in France for a short period, but of course he was now trying to implement the physiocratic ideals and physiocratic policies, and that meant that he started to impose what in English we just call it a uniform tax, and shifting the tax burden away from the agricultural sector to the land, where the surplus actually is, namely to the clergy and to the landowners. Mpumelelo.
My question is in relation to Turgot and the physiocrats, because I read that Turgot didn't really have a problem with usury, but the physiocrats emphasize that the agricultural sector is the one that is the productive sector in the economy amongst the three sectors. So do the physiocrats view the do the physiocrats view the use of usury as productive to the economy as a whole, in that it can facilitate capital for the agricultural sector and then infiltrate it into it being more productive for the whole economy? Or do they look at usury as something that is just not productive and maybe a hindrance to the production of the economy?
That's right. I mean, they would not have, contrary to the scholastics, they would not have wanted to disallow it or make it illegal, as the scholastics and earlier scholars did. But they would certainly have regarded it as non-productive. The financial sector would have been regarded as non-productive. Maybe redistributive, maybe it can sustain itself, but it's not going to create a surplus. And you're going to find that idea emerge again, certainly in the work of Karl Marx, and you will also see it in the work of Veblen, the old American institutionalist economist, that when they look at the financial sector, they don't see it as being productive in the way that neoclassical economics or classical economics would see it as productive. And of course, you know, I mean, in new institutional economics, in finance sees itself. We'll get to that. And again, it's a different view of it. So, but even though the physiocrats wouldn't see it as productive, because by definition they're saying there's nothing productive except for the agricultural sector. But, you know, in a sense, these are only details to the degree that they've established the idea of a model. And as we, in the next, from the time of 1760 with Quenet, to the present, as we are opening our understanding or our acceptance of what is productive, so we are accepting. I mean, we really developing the ideas and the model building that was first introduced by the physiocrats, and the differences become less glaring. They're based on, like, you know, if you decide that only the agricultural sector is productive, well, what happens? Well, obviously by deduction, all the other sectors should not be encouraged, but only the agricultural sector. You change your definition, you can still use the physiocratic thinking about the course of nature, about the natural law, about what people actually do, as opposed to, you can still take that thinking and then apply it. So you're applying an approach rather than just applying the definitions and the assumptions that they started with. And so Turgot was the Minister of Finance, but with his reforms, he wasn't a very liked person. And he, I mean, you know, there's a bit about that in the video. Yes, he was dismissed by the king, but really because the clergy, the nobility, and everybody wanted his neck. Also, the manufacturers and even the farmers didn't like him, because in terms of laissez-faire, he was also promoting what? He was also promoting free import of goods and export of goods. And so all the vested interests, farming, nobility, and artisans were against Turgot, and by force he had to be dismissed by the king. But the thing, of course, is, I don't know, the time that was a lost opportunity for the French economy. Many are saying that was a lost opportunity for the French economy. Had the king listened to the recommendation of the physiocrats, so what liberal economists argue, had he followed the recommendations and persisted with Turgot, well, he didn't live for much longer, then the French Revolution could have been avoided. But since he didn't, and France continued being impoverished, the natural outcome was that there was a revolution and the king and Marie Antoinette lost their heads. Any questions? And so then we're done for today.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye.
We'll talk
Thank
on
you. Thank you.
whatever.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Sorry, before.
There's a question.
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to ask quickly if the same rule applies for this week's assignment, no bibliography.
No, okay, if you want to have a bibliography, if you're quoting directly, you can put a bibliography, but it will not count. Put it like this, for this essay, yes, if you have a bibliography, that will be great. If you've got mistakes in the bibliography, I'm not going to mark you down, but it's not going to count in the word counts. But yes, I would, in this case, I would appreciate the bibliography, not necessary, but I will appreciate it. It will enhance my reading, because what I often do, I come across something, you say A, B, and C, and I like to learn from you. I like to learn new things, and I always learn from students. So if you said something that interests me, and there's a bibliography, I will go and read that up if possible. And therefore, in this particular case, yes, I would like a bibliography, but it's optional.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Doctor. I wanted to, because you said that some scholars say that the French Revolution would probably wouldn't have happened if the what you call this thing, if the king allowed for Tubul's principles to flourish in France, and that there being a tax, a uniform tax, and so forth. But don't you think that that's probably a misunderstanding of politics in relation to that? Probably the king did not have that amount of power to assert to that nation, in that if the aristocrats and the nobility and the clergy revolt against his rule, then it puts his rule in jeopardy. I think you're muted.
I was saying that I agree with you. The king really was between a rock and a hard place. If he had the choice of antagonizing the nobility, the aristocracy, and he would have suffered the consequences immediately, being unpopular. He wouldn't have known that he's going to lose his head if he doesn't go that direction. So I agree with you. There probably wasn't much that he could have done. He obviously was acting what he thought is rational, and he tried to steer this course in a non-radical way, as so often happens. Not if he had known that it's going to turn out this, he would have acted differently. But there was no way for him to know. So I agree with you. It would be a naive view of understanding. It certainly would not be a Machiavellian view of understanding the situation, because the Machiavellian view would be exactly that. The king, first of all, is going to make sure he stays in power. And so he's not going to do what's going to make him popular. He doesn't even have to care about the economic situation of the people and of the masses. He's just got to stay in power. But in a sense, he would have to stay in power and make sure he's got a strong enough army to quell any revolt. But I think we're in agreement. Yes, it is simplistic to put it like this.
And you said that you regard your thoughts as discrete, but when you're speaking on the history of economic thought, you asserted, or what I took from it was that you implied that it's almost continuous in that, the thoughts are, they in a sense are influenced by thoughts that come from previous times. So there seems to be a continuity of thought, even though it changes over time. So, would there be a difference in how a person thinks and how to conceptualize the thought process as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, no, I get what you're saying, because our thought, not our thoughts, but our, you can add one thought next to another thought, and that's what we're doing in the history of economic thought. And we're adding them all one next to the other, and so we are tracing an evolution. And certainly the evolution, might create the notion of continuity and not being discrete. But the fact that what I was more concerned about is that just as you're only having one discrete thought in your mind at any moment in time, likewise, when you are talking of the evolution of our thoughts in the history of economic thought, the way you express them are one sentence by another sentence by another sentence by another sentence by another sentence. And so what you have the evolution made up of a sequence of discrete sentences, but the sentences are still discrete. The thoughts are still discrete. The evolution itself, the sum. I mean, it's this. What we've got here is a situation of the whole is greater than its parts. The parts, our history of economic thought is made up of our parts, discrete individual thoughts, discrete individual sentences. But what the history of economic thought is, in terms of its evolution, is more than those discrete individual sentences. And so if we even able to talk about, you see, when we're talking about things like evolution or the history of economic thought, we're really acknowledging that there is something meaningful to those words, meaningful beyond just the individual sentences. And therefore, we are as if acknowledging that they are not just discrete, but they are those real type of metaphysical entities. It's a very good point you're raising there. Thank you very much. I mean, I've tried to answer that.
Okay,
what do you think?
Okay. No, I think you answered me well. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for your input, Mpumelelo.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yes. Bye. Bye-bye. Bye, Eden. Bye, Mpumelelo.